Time for the recap. We're giving the recap. It's the recap show. You're going to get the recap. I'm the guy who gives a recap. Let's all get a recap. It's that show you know. Hey, everybody. I think I am live. I had some internet problems where I started the stream and my internet completely died all the way across the whole network. So I don't know what happened there, but thank you so much for joining me. I apologize for the little hiccup there. We're doing the best we can in Los Angeles. Maybe it's the rain. Who knows? Who knows? So, today is our recap show. We, of course, are playing through the Adventurers League Storm King's Thunder. Tuesdays, we talk about what's going to happen in the session. Wednesdays, I go off, take my party by the dice, shake them until all of their hit points are strewn about the table in a giant pile, and then I slap them around with a couple of magic items. So that could be interpreted a number of disturbing ways. That's what happens. There we go. So, hey everybody, thank you so much for joining me. Braid, Mordite, Blade, good to see you in the El Chatterumo. So today, Thursdays, we come back and I report how it all went. You know, maybe some point in the future we will do a prep show and then an actual play show and maybe a recap show, but you'll actually be able to see the game as it plays out. We're talking about it. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens here in the near future. So right now I'm committed to playing Wednesday nights at my friendly friendly local game store for Adventurers League, and we had a good time last night. So today's topics, we're going to recap what happened. We are going to talk about revealing the meta plot. Something interesting happened last night, which we will discuss, and I want to get into that. Also, I have some time, hopefully, here to take your questions, as I did on Tuesday. I'm happy to answer those. If you have something, pop it in the chat, or, well, that's the best thing to do right now, because I can check my phone, but it's rude, so I'm not going to. So I didn't get anything over Twitter that was that I recall. So we'll just we'll stick with what's going on here in the live chat room. So with that in mind, let's recap the session. The plan, as outlined on Tuesday, was to advance the action, right? So we weren't going to pick up right from where we left off before we took the holiday break. And I talked a lot on Tuesday about how the advantage to having a long break like that is that you can take some liberties with the timeline of events. So essentially you can fast forward your players through some stuff that they might have enjoyed playing, but which isn't necessary to play. So it gives you an opportunity to do some editing. So that is in fact what I did. So I wrote them up a little note that basically said, all right, when you left off, you had gotten a note from Jorgen saying, please come to Citadel Felbar. You took advantage of the Harper teleportation circles, so I reinforced the idea that they had those. And then I also introduced the idea that, well, there was a lot of overland travel from Everland up to Silverly Moon, up to Hawk's Nest, up to Citadel Felbar. It was largely uneventful. And I did actually roll for those random encounters without the players being there. Just sort of behind the scenes, roll for random encounters. And I came up with one. And specifically, it was a dig site. So the party is supposed to come upon some fire giants who are reclaiming a fragment of the Voinandad rod. Voinandad? I don't remember. At any rate, so that's the main fire giant quest, right? So they're assembling this giant colossus thing together. So you're supposed to come upon a fire giant and his entourage of ogres and hobgoblins and goblins who have all been excavating this thing out there, and they've basically dug out this giant crater. Well, rather than have them come upon that and pick up the session with, well, what do? Instead, I had them encounter this crater and what was left behind. So essentially, they had missed this action. The fire giant and his lackeys had been there, hauled the thing out of the ground, whatever it was, and dragged it off to the northeast in the direction of Mount Hammerhast. So that was just rolled into the recap. So that way, I don't have to have a dynamic random encounter that eats up a lot of time. Like, okay, we're gonna have combat and maybe not necessarily learn anymore. It's very similar to a couple encounters that we've already had. So rather than go through that again, I fast forward the chronology of what had happened, and they came upon the scene after the fire giants had already excavated it, right? And that way, they learned something, hopefully, or at least there's a clue or a hint that something was going on, but we don't have to, you can hand wave the action and keep going. I did that. I described to them how immediately upon their arrival at Citadel Felbar, they were invited to an audience with the king and queen. And the king and queen welcomed them with open arms and talked about how grateful they were that they had agreed to go and investigate the mysterious fire giant activity up at Mount Hammerhast in the old Iron Slag Forge. And the king and queen promised to reward them handsomely if they came back with Duke Zalto's head. And Jorgen was there, and so the next line of the recap is basically like, Jorgen volunteered you, and you look at Jorgen, and Jorgen goes, yeah, that's where my axe is. What are you going to do? So, I don't know. I thought that was a funny moment. But, and then in this kind of interlude, as I described it, I talked about how the next day they set out across the frozen wilderness, and I described the cold forest and or cold wood. It's all part of the glimmer wood. So there's like 3 forests that have all grown together. And this one, I described, it's a lot of pine trees, and there's snow on the ground, and there's very thick, pine forest canopy above them that kind of blots out the daylight. And I talk about how cold and miserable it is, and how their feet are always wet, and their sleeping bags are never warm. But Jorgen seems right at home. He's having a jolly time. He loves the cold. He loves being out. He's excited to be on his way. And his enthusiasm ends up being kind of contagious. And so you're 1 day away from reaching Mount Hammerhast, and you're actually looking forward to what's going on, to prying the secrets forth from the mountain. So that was great. I felt obligated, to give them some room to set the scene the way they wanted to set it, right? So, and by that I mean, okay, you're about 8 hours away from reaching Mount Hammerhast. The snow and the wind has begun to pick up. There's some sort of blizzard kind of moving in. How do you want to proceed in your approach? I described how they had countered these essentially sort of like clear-cut roads that the fire giants had just like mowed these swaths, these long kind of like burnt-out trails of ash that went through the woods, that they were clearly using as kind of quick roads to lead them off someplace. But how Jorgen had cautioned them about traveling along those roads, because that probably means there's going to be fire giants using them on a regular basis, and it's going to be difficult for them to approach with stealth. And he's like, we don't want to be seen until we get there and kind of figure out what's going on. So I said, well, how do you want to do this? Do you want to go through the woods? Is there something, how do you want to take your stealthy approach to coming up and coming upon them, traveling in the last final 8 hours or 7 hours it is to the mountain? Well, they did decide to travel along the side of one of these logged out trails, for lack of a better term. They did decide to travel along one of these logged out trails, and but they wanted to travel off to the side so that they wouldn't be spotted. They could have an idea if somebody was coming. They could kind of melt into the woods if they so chose. So it was 8 hours. I decided since they're so close to the Iron Slag Forge that I would roll for random encounters. I think I basically did every hour. No, I did every 2 hours. And sure enough, on the fourth roll, I came up with something. And I was a little apprehensive about this because I did not want to get into... I knew that we had a lot of encounter ahead of us that was pre-planned, that were set encounters, and I did not want to spend time in a combat just for a combat's sake. We've talked about this before, and that's the trap of random encounters, is that it just turns into a combat. So that's still a lesson that I have a tough time taking to heart, because that's my instinct, that's my gut response when I roll a random encounter is, oh, now what are they going to fight? As I've cautioned you before, be very careful with that attitude. If a fight fits into the mood of the party or fits in thematically, then it can, set the table for what's to come ahead, or bleed them of some resources in case you feel like they're coming into whatever the planned encounter is. They're coming in with a little too much firepower, a little too much resources, or whatever. The complicating factor with that is if they get into a fight and it drains them of some what they consider significant resources, they may then decide to take a short rest. Okay? So the timeline that you might have projected can start to get a little wobbly if the players are like, well, look, we're still 4 hours away. Why don't we just take a short rest right now for an hour and we'll still be 4 hours away? Who cares? So it's a very tricky situation to balance. You roll for a random encounter. How are you going to respond and incorporate that random encounter? A lot of the things in the book are set up as you come upon a scene of a fire giant and a bunch of hobgoblins and ogres. Well, you're either going to avoid them if you're scared of them, or if you're a party of players who are probably, if I had rolled that encounter and described that for them, top of the night, fresh off of a 3-week break, full capacity, full powers, they would have, without hesitating, they would have gotten into a fight with that particular encounter. They would have just, tried to ambush them as quickly as possible. So, reading the mood and reading the situation of your players and of your party is key when you have something spontaneous like this sort of pop up. I rolled on the random encounter table for the mountains, and it came up 1d3 frost giants. So that posed actually a really interesting opportunity, which it made me wonder, all right, they're so close to Iron Slag. This place should be just teeming with fire giants, fire giant allies, maybe some escaped slaves, whatever. But, why would frost giants be that close to what's essentially the fire giant, main base, right? Their chief lair, or their chief's lair, however you want to describe it. So, I got to thinking, all right, now all of this is coming off the top of my head. I did not take my own advice and pre-roll these random encounters and put some thought into what was happening, what was going on. So I thought to myself, okay, well, they've got Jorgen with them, and ostensibly the whole quest here is to go into Iron Slag and retrieve Jorgen's axe, right? It's been established that Jorgen was probably a fairly, or is a fairly powerful frost giant, but he got kidnapped and stripped of all of his equipment. So he's been taken down quite a notch, right? And when I look at the stats of Harshnag in the book, there's a lot of juice there, right? So he's got a really nice set of plate mail and a super powerful axe. I had not described any of that stuff to the players. He's just a regular frost giant as far as they know. I've described how he had an axe and maybe what it looked like, and that was his really nice axe, and they were all, impressed. Like it fit with with the image of who he was, but he didn't have it. So they're like, we understand why he's on a quest for it, because this thing sounds like it kicks ass, which of course it does. So what are these frost giants doing here? Well, I knew that there was another piece of equipment that I hadn't described Jorgen as having, and I had thought about like Jorgen going, oh, while I was here in Citadel Felbar, I had some armor commissioned or something like that, and he's got this plate mail or whatever. But I knew that he didn't have the plate mail that was described in the book. So I roll for 3 frost giants, and I think to myself, this is our opportunity to introduce the armor, right? And so I'm kind of just furiously like turning wheels in my brain, like, okay, why would these 3 frost giants be delivering armor to Jorgen? And so the party, comes upon, after a little bit of cat and mouse with, we're not sure what's up ahead, there's something hiding in the snow. It looks like it's 3 giants, let's go around it, and then they end up getting followed, and finally they get caught up with the 3 frost giants. And Jorgen recognizes them, they recognize Jorgen. So I come up with this interesting scene where it's, they turn out to be his cousins. The 3 frost giants are his cousins. And they tell a couple things. They're like, we need to tell you something. The ordning is broken. You can't trust anybody. And Jorgen was like, anybody? And they're like, you can't trust anybody. And they throw this bag in the snow, and it makes this clanking noise. And he looks and he opens it up, and inside is this plate mail. And they're like, this is yours. We have bad news. Your father's dead. And Jorgen's like, my father's dead? Like, what happened? And they're like, our father killed him. And that was, a fairly interesting, emotional moment for Jorgen. The party is kind of taking this in going like, oh man, are we about to get in the middle of a huge frost giant brawl? Like we got your back, Jorgen, we're ready to go. And the 3 cousins are like, we don't agree with how it went down, and we don't agree with what happened, but we decided to bring this as a peace offering. It's rightfully yours. We're here to deliver it. We hope you find what you're looking for. We are going to Svardborg. They're putting together a hunting expedition. You are welcome to join us if you so choose. And Jorgen says, good luck hunting. I hope you enjoy yourselves, because this may be the last hunt you ever go on. And with that, the 3 cousins go their way, and Jorgen kind of turns and starts putting on his father's armor. And when I described that, it's very ornately inscribed, and it still has dragon claw marks in it. It clearly must have been involved in the giant dragon wars, etc. So, make an impression. All right, this is not just your average set of giant-sized plate mail for what it is. So that was an interesting little scene. That was a random encounter that was compelling and conveyed information and did not involve much of a fight. It didn't involve any combat. It did involve some stealth rolls and the party kind of trying to gain an advantage on, a potential ambush that they were concerned about. So that was an interesting scene. The rest of the travel to Mount Hammerhast went uneventfully. I need to caution you guys about this portion of the adventure, or at least this very specific point in the adventure, namely approaching the mountain. Because it's chapter 8, I think it's sort of assumed that the players are going to fly there. You know, it's assumed they've gone to the Temple of Anon, the Allfather, and gotten the quests from the Oracle, and they're using the Cult of the Dragon airship, and they're just kind of zipping around the realms and approaching everything from the air. And that's a fine assumption, given, you know, the way that the book is structured and the way that the plot is laid out. That's fine. It does also give options for, if you approach by land, here's what happens. The reason I want to caution you about this is I approached from land, and because of the dual nature of, like, well, they might show up just kind of however, there's no real boxed text on this saying, this is, you know, if they approach from land, read this. If they approach from the air, read this. It talks about the circumstances of what's going on. It does not give you a specific description. You know, through the sleet and the snow part to reveal Mount Hammerhast, you see a giant set of 50-foot tall adamantine doors set into the cliff face of the mountain. Alongside the doors is a set of 15-foot wide stone steps that have been chiseled into the side of the cliff. They're sized for medium humanoids and appear to scale the face of the mountain. Like, I wish I had written that down, because that would be helpful, but there's nothing that is that direct and describes all the features and how they connect and all that sort of stuff, right? So the issue being, like, I ended up, like, flipping through the book back and forth quite a bit, kind of fumbling with, like, I was under the mistaken impression that the adamantine doors are kind of halfway up the mountain, which, no, they're in the center of the mountain, but not in the center of the mountain vertically. They're in the center of the mountain, at the base of the mountain, in the center of the cliff face. So, hey, Alira, if you are considering, if you're going to use this particular point of the adventure, just do a little pre-prep, right, of thinking about, okay, well, how is my party going to approach, and how do I want to describe the scene when they come upon it? Because I really wish I had had something prepped that said, all right, so when they emerge from the woods, here's how I'm going to describe the scene they see in front of them. So that was very muddy, and I don't think I did a good job of conveying what happened. And also, they didn't really, like, it's very difficult for them to understand, like, what are we looking for? How are we, we're looking for this forge that's somewhere inside this mountain. And then they get there, and you want them to climb the steps, but it's not obvious, like, that's the way the end of the forge, right? Clearly, the obvious way into the forge is the giant adamantium doors, which you could spend a lot of time screwing around with and probably never open. You know, you're not going to somehow divine that passphrase or something like that. So that's something that's a little wonky, right? That could be, I think there's an assumption of intent that the party will know why they're there and what they're going after, but it's still pretty weird to go, okay, we're looking for a fire giant forge, and then you see this yak folk kind of pseudo-Tibetan kind of mountaintop village with these stepped fields and stuff, and you're like, well, that doesn't look like a fire giant settlement, you know. So it was it got a little muddy in terms of transitioning from the overland travel into let's encounter the area. So that was the thing that I wish I had brushed up on a little bit. They climb the steps. I made a little bit of a chore out of it because I'm like, it's been snowing a lot. Are you going to tie each other together? You might slip on the stairs if you want to travel at a normal pace. But if you're going to travel at a slow pace, you can just kind of climb the stairs and be careful, and you'll be fine. You're all tied together. So those are always kind of tricky things. Like, do you want to make scaling the cliff face tedious and make a whole bunch of rolls and then they fall down? And, you know, it's one of those situations where they can take obvious precautions and feel like we're safe, and then a fluke die roll could cause, you know, they tied themselves all to the giant, and that's great. If any of them falls, the giant's going to be able to catch any and all of them. But if the giant falls, then they're all in trouble, right? So do you want to make a scene where the giant trips, and now everybody is like Panic City because they're all going to fall 250 feet to their deaths, right? I ultimately decided I don't want to deal with a fluke, take the chance, the 5% chance that an odd fluke die roll is going to screw up the works. And I'm just like, all right, if you go at a slow, steady pace and really take your time and be careful, you can climb up. They get halfway up, they find the Chimera's lair. That's halfway up the mountain, or 2/3 of the way up, whatever it is. And I said, you know, you can see bones scattered about, and there's clearly a nest been built in the back of this area. You know, do you want to investigate it? Or do you want to keep going? Half the party was like, let's keep going. Half the party was investigate it. I'm like, well, you got to pick one, guys. Are you investigating or are you keeping going? Well, we'll just do a quick search. I'm like, you're going to have to go over there. There's no such thing as a quick search. Do you want to search it? Yes. So they ultimately, 4 of the characters went and searched the nest. And they all rolled terrible. None of them could get above a 10 on an intelligence investigation check. And I had kind of used a die roll assertion that I made a die roll assertion that the Chimera was not there. Great, works out great. So they went, but then when they all rolled really garbage, then I was like, okay, well, as you're searching through, and you found some things, you know, but you can tell that this nest has been like mulched up, right? So you don't find the body of a gnome. You find a gnome's ankle that has been, you know, mulched into the mud and earth and like chewed up and masticated and then spit back out. And then you find a gnome's femur, and that's in a different spot. His hat is in one spot. You know, like whatever this corpse was eaten, and then parts of it were spit back out and incorporated all over into this lair. So it's not discrete little clumps of like, oh, well, we're going to strip down this halfling's body and take his cloak and his pouch of, you know, treasure and see whatever potion bottles he's like. And it's not that convenient. So as you're searching this area, suddenly you hear a screech from the sky, and this 3-headed creature, you know, flies down to the body of a lion, and they fairly quickly figure out that it's a chimera. But then we got into a little random encounter combat, which it's not actually completely random encounter, right? Like, it's a pre-planned encounter. It could or could not happen. And after they rolled crappy, I was like, well, we've been gaming for about an hour. We've had this heavy emotional role-playing scene that they mostly observed. Let's get them into the action. So the Chimera comes down, surprises everybody because they're so busy searching, and defends its nest by breathing fire on the 4 characters who are in the nest. Well, 7d8 fire damage is a lot of hit points for a 6th level character. He did like 36 points of damage and really roasted those guys, and that got their attention. I can tell that the monk character is going to be a real problem because he's a shadow monk and he has 2 abilities which he is relentless about using. And the most common use is his shadow step. So he can go, you know, basically kind of like free teleport from place to place. And then secondly, he can spend his key points to try and stun creatures. And right off the bat, he stuns the Chimera, and that was it for the Chimera. So they were sweating quite a bit. Like right off the bat, they took a ton of damage, and then they calmed down a little bit when it got stunned. And then Jorgen walked over and got out his regular great axe and was like, thwack, thwack. Now, I'm not using Jorgen as written in terms of Harshnag is written so that he holds back a little bit. He waits to go last in combat. Now, he has been going last in combat just because I've been rolling crappy. I may make that into a permanent thing. But the other point of what happened was Jorgen walks up and he does 3d12 plus 6 with every single hit, and he's got plus 9 to hit. He hits most everything. So he goes up, thwacks this thing twice, and it's almost toast. And then the monk finally finished it off with a flurry of blows. So it was a fun encounter. And then they found a ton of magic items, right? So I rolled for the magic items that are supposed to be in the nest, and I also awarded them the figurines of wondrous power that the king and queen in Citadel Felbar are supposed to give them for having the mark of commendation. Right, so they got a pile of magic items. They were very happy about that. They continue on up the mountain. They come up the they come up to the Yak Folk village, which one of the reasons I didn't get started exactly on time here is this. So this is out there. This map is out there in your Dropbox folder. That is an unlabeled Yak Folk map village that I essentially sort of traced because I want to take some notes on this thing. And I will drop notes for you Patreon backers on here. I'm going to do a daytime version of this, and I'm going to do a nighttime version of this so that you know how many Yak Folk are in which portion of the village at any given time. And I'll probably note how many, where slaves are located during those day and night versions. But if you are interested in using this on your own, it is in the general, I believe it's in the general Dropbox folder right now. So you should be able to access that with the same link that that Farquaad popped up in there earlier. In fact, let's just double check. I'm going to take a look in the saving throw files. So it's chapter 8 _ yak _ village _ unlabeled.gif. Right? So you guys feel free to use those. I'm going to... I wish I had had this prepped last night. So this is another learning lesson for me. I spent quite a bit of time going, how many Yak Folk are in each of these structures, and where do they go, what do they do when the alarm gets raised? So that brings us to what happened next. So they come up the trail, they think about crossing the bridge, but instead they pop up over the wall here, and they see on the, I guess it would be the eastern side if the top of the map is north, on the eastern side, on the eastern side, which is actually over here, so these 4 structures over here, they see these things. So they see this water wheel, they see the hut that looks like it's milling flour, they see a couple other huts and a barn, and they don't see anybody outside. Well, according to the description, it was daylight, it was daytime. According to the description, these guys, the Yak Folk, are all inside basically watching their slaves do stuff. Okay, you guys fill up those sacks of flour, we're going to sit here and smoke our pipes. Over here, you guys, milk the goats or whatever it is, we're going to sit here and smoke our pipes. So they come up to the top. The monk Shadow steps up to the top of the wall. The wall is 20 feet tall. He steps up to the top of the wall. And then Shadow steps over to the set of doors, right, that are barred from the inside. He flips the bar open and opens the door and lets the party into this eastern half of the compound. Now I described how the wind is sort of whistling by, it's gusty, they're not in the snow anymore, but they're definitely struggling. Or there's a lot of wind, their voices, can't be heard very far, don't really carry. But they're also traveling with an 18-foot tall giant, or 16-foot tall, or whatever Jorgen is. There's got to be some downside to traveling with Jorgen, and a large part of that is it's hard to be super stealthy. So I again did just sort of a random check to see, okay, is anybody going to happen to notice them while they're standing here in the courtyard? And that went badly for them, and sure enough, a Yak Folk warrior, stepped out of the flour mill and decided to light his pipe, and then he looks up, and I go, he's got his pipe in one hand, and he's got a plug of tobacco in the other, and he's looking down at his pipe, and then he looks up and sees you and starts looking at you. What are you going to do? Now, I chose to have them roll for initiative in order to play this situation out in a way that seemed orderly and spontaneous. So, if I wanted to be a little gentler, I could have just said, what's your initial reaction? What do you guys as a party, what do you want to do? And given them 2 minutes as a party to talk it over and go, I don't know, do you want to fight this guy? You want to try and make peace with him? You want to parlay? What do you want? What do you think? I don't know. The last guy we talked to, like, give them that 2 minutes, like, suspended time, and let them follow through with a little consideration. I chose not to do that, and I think that's fine. Like that's how the party learns to work together, right? Is like things go wrong and they see things go wrong. So at any rate, they go into initiative, and the guy at the top of the initiative is the dwarven fighter, and he's like, I go over there and stab the dude. And everybody else is like, no. And he's like, that's what my character would do. And then that's what he did. He went and stabbed the guy for 20 points of damage. Okay, well, there you go. The next guy in line is the cleric. He goes, I'm going to heal this guy for 10 points and go, this was a mistake. We're sorry. No, we don't mean to attack you. Which at that point, the horse has left the barn a little bit, but that's what he chose to do. Okay, well, he's healed back up. He's now only down 11 hit points. And the monk is the third one in line, and he's like, no, we've already, we've broken this guy's nose. It's over. We're going to have to, take this guy out. And he, wham, 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 starts going after the guy. So he did like another 10 or 15 points of damage. So it was, it was a mess. The guy ends up sounding the alarm. More yak folk come out. There's this huge skirmish sort of breaks out. And 3 more yak folk come out of the various buildings over here, right? And the bard, looks around, and he's, the bard really wanted... So there's also this great moment where the bard casts Calm Emotions on the party. He's like, stop fighting these dudes. Calm emotions. And then everybody's like, okay, well, I can't fight these dudes. And then 3 more guys came out and were like, whack, whack, whack. And they're like, no, I would have attacked that guy if I hadn't had calm emotions on me. So that was interesting. So the bard was definitely in favor of, let's try to haggle and negotiate with these dudes. So the bard points at the water wheel that's spinning above the creek and goes, stand down, or I'll blow it up. And I go, okay, well, roll an intimidation check. And he spends some inspiration to get advantage, and he rolls a 2 and an 8. And I'm like, all right, well, one of these yak folk dudes is stunned, so he can't do anything. But the other 2 are going to assess the threat that they see this 14-year-old boy making. And I rolled a 16 and a 19, and... forget it. They were like, yeah, right. And so they grab their swords and slash at the monk, and at that point the monk's ready to action goes off. He fireballs the wooden water wheel, and somebody in the group goes, and he blows the thing to pieces, right? He does whatever, 20-some points of damage. So he blows the thing to pieces. Somebody in the group goes, how big is that fireball? And he's like, well, it's a 20-foot radius. And I go, well, it's probably not going through the mountain. The mountain is it's probably not going into the hole where the shaft is coming through. But if you're going to hit that thing, you're definitely going to hit that granary, that flour mill. And he's like, yeah, I probably am. And so... so I go, you know what? Let's go back to the village of Nightstone when a young, enterprising dragonborn sorcerer decided to take out a goblin who was hiding inside of a flour mill by casting a firebolt through the window. Boom! Well, he blew up the flour mill, and it starts frying and whatnot. And that was the point at which they found out that the Yak folk were keeping dwarven slaves. And the dwarven fighter was like, oh. Yeah, first the dwarven fighter was like, oh no, like, we killed the prisoners and it all was my fault because I started this violence. And then I'm like, you can tell that they were probably slaves, not prisoners. They're not in there as like, this isn't like a jail cell. They were clearly working. And he's like, oh, well, that changes it completely. So here's the thing. If they hadn't started to fight right away, they could have negotiated with the Yak folk. I mean, the Yak folk are ultimately going to betray them, right? But if they had wiped out all of these Yak folk on this half of the map in a rather conventional fashion, then the Yak folk on this half of the map probably wouldn't know what was going on. Unfortunately, they did it in such a flashy way that all of the forces on the western side of the map got alerted. And so they hear the gong start going off, and a couple rounds go by, and they mop up the rest of the Yak folk, and then they parade over, and they're trying to break in the door. They can't. The monk is shadow jumping around, and he starts checking the buildings that the various Yak folk are coming out of, because he sees one of the Yak folk warriors like come out of a barn, but he's got his sword out and he's wiping blood off of it. And he's like, whoa, that's not good. And he goes in that room, and you find 2 slaves that have had their throats cut. Oh, that's not good. I go in that room over there. Okay, you find a moon elf slave who's had her head decapitated. Ah, God, no, I go in that room over there. Okay, you find 2, dwarven slaves who have been run through the stomach. Ah! So it was kind of a parade of nightmares. So they go around kind of round robin, and then the chief of the village and his 2 Yak folk priest wives come out, and he turns to his one wife and says, you take some guys and go take care of that monk who's running around. I'm going to deal with these guys. And he gets out this great sword, and flames come flying out along it, and he strides forward. And then they had set sort of like a trap, right? So they'd set like the Yak folk form this semicircle and ready attacks if anybody comes close. And the monk shadow steps in, flings the door open, and then shadow steps back out. Actually, he ran up, flings the bolt back on the door, and then shadow steps out. He's got tons of movement because his shadow step is a bonus action. So the party all stands there, and they're like, oh, we thought they were going to charge us. And the Yak folk are like, we thought they were going to charge us. And Jorgen goes, you know what? I'll go in and charge. And he waltzes in there. Oh, no. As soon as that door opens up, the bard drops another fireball. Woof! Hits all of the Yak folk forces and does 32 points of damage to most of them. So that was pretty brutal, right? And so then Jorgen is like, well, if they've all got ready to tax, I'm not afraid. I've got my new armor, and I'm going to take... My phone's ringing again, you guys. Suspected spam caller. Thank you. Thank you, phone. I'm not sure what that's all about. All right. The phone is the new mailman. So at any rate, the Yak folk get fireballed, and the Jorgen strides in and is like, well, I'll take on this chief. And he goes, wham, wham. And, the Yak folk chief is standing there, ready, and he's got his ready to attack, and he swings his blade out and misses Jorgen. And Jorgen chops his arms off at the elbow. The sword drops on the ground. The Yak folk chieftain looks down at this thing, and the next thing, the blade goes through the back of his neck, and his head falls onto the burning blade at his feet. Everybody else in the Yak folk village looks around like, whoosh. And that was where we cut the session for the night. We ran out of time. So that was a thing. They still have. So another cool thing that happened was the Yak folk priestess points at Jorgen, holds up her holy symbol, makes some sort of, divine intonation, and Jorgen makes his saving throw. For a minute, he sort of flickers out of existence, but then he, doubles down and shrugs off the effect and manages to stay on the prime material plane. So that was also a wake-up call for the party, was, oh, this guy, he's not just some warrior dude with a flaming sword. He's got a priest accompanying him who can cast banishment. Yes, he does. All right. That took way longer than I wanted to take, that recap. But thank you for bearing with me. It was a very exciting, intense session, and it was emotionally affecting for them. I'm not sure, what lesson they're going to take away from this thing, because it was sort of ambiguous at first. Should we parlay with these guys or not? And at the end of the session, I did have to kind of raise the curtain and say, well, you could have parlayed with these guys, and they would have given you this huge feast and invited you to smoke with the chieftain and fed you all this soup and food and had dancing for you, and then about 2 hours later, you would have had to make a series of saving throws against all of the poison that they just loaded you down with. So I clued them in on the fact that this was a tough encounter, like, by nature. Right, and that it was going to probably end in combat and betrayal in some way, shape, or form, anyhow, and that these guys were actually very, very cruel and sadistic creatures. So I don't know that they actually learned a lesson in terms of talk first and then shoot if you have to. I think their barnstorming ways are going to continue, but it'll be interesting, right? It was definitely like there were a lot of dice on the table. They were taking damage left and right. It was a very climactic, suspenseful type of combat, and that's good, right? And we unfortunately had to cliffhanger it. We'll see how they clean up with the rest of it. Their ace in the hole is Jorgen, right? Like, that whole combat would have gone completely differently, would have gone south without Jorgen. And actually, if Jorgen had gotten banished, I think they would have been in real dire straits too. As it is, like, with Jorgen on their side, and he's at full hit points, he hasn't taken really any damage, I think they're going to be okay. So I want to quick talk about just one quick thing here before we sort of move on here. I'm going to have to wrap right pretty close to 3 o'clock, right? So, revealing the meta plot. This random encounter that they had on their way to Iron Slag with the 3 frost giants could have just been 3 frost giants are out hunting fire giants, and they decide to turn on you, or they see part of the party and they start attacking them, or whatever. It could have just been a combat encounter. But instead, I used it as an opportunity to set a very emotionally laden scene, which I was fortunate enough to just improvise off the top of my head at that moment, right? But rather than having it be a combat encounter, it revealed some significant things that had not been revealed before. So up until this point, the party has had no idea that there was a thing called the Ordning. They don't know what it is. They don't know what it means. They don't know how it's enforced. They don't know what the big deal is about the Ordning. At this point, they still don't know exactly what it is or how it's enforced. But they know that there is a thing called the Ordning, and they know that it's a big deal. They don't know why it's a big deal, but they know, oh, this basically means there's some sort of fire or frost giant war on. Well, okay, they didn't ask any follow-up questions, and I wasn't going to volunteer any, but at some point it's going to come back around to, it's not just a frost giant war. It's a much bigger deal than that. It's all of the giants are essentially competing to become, the head of the Ordning and revise the role of giants and the hierarchy of giants to benefit themselves. So that's it was a great technique for bringing out the meta plot in a way that was personal, that was meaningful, that they were witness to, that they were directly involved in, or at least they're directly allied with Jorgen. And so because this thing happened and his father got murdered, like they're personally and emotionally invested in it. And it means more than Jorgen walking up to them and going, I've heard you're good adventurers. I've heard you're pure of heart. I need your help because my people are in trouble. Like that's a nice proposition. It's it's strangely complimentary to the party. I'm a frost giant. I'm one of the most powerful frost giants in the Forgotten Realms, but I need your help. And my people are in trouble is a very humble thing for a giant to say. However, it's far more compelling. And, I have to say, like, I personally got kind of, like, emotional just portraying the scene. And a lot of it is I hadn't thought of this beforehand. But it certainly raises the stakes. It's a huge thing. Patricide is, there's a reason that Disney movies use that so commonly as they murder one of the parents, is because it's a very personally compelling experience. Or evocative is maybe a better word than compelling. I don't know. Compelling always seems like, oh, it grabs your attention. Well, it does grab your attention, but it stirs up all kinds of emotions for you. So I just want to use this as an example of ways to reveal what's happening in your meta plot, reveal what's happening in the game world, and tie it to personal events. It doesn't have to be a personal event in the PC. Sometimes, or within the party of the PCs. Sometimes it feels a little on the nose. It's a little too much like, well, of course, you're the chosen one because we're playing the adventure, and the chosen one has to be somebody in the party because that's the way it works, right? But it's somebody that the PCs are allied with, are on very friendly terms with, somebody they care about and that they're interested in helping, and then this horrible thing happens as a result of something going on in the meta plot. And if they actually bothered to ask around the campfire, like, what's this ordning thing mean anyhow? They will get more details from Jorgen, right? So I now have an opportunity for him to volunteer information without it coming out of the blue, without it seeming like, okay, I'm hitting you with exposition now. And also, it was a very nice sudden turn and contrast for Jorgen to be out in the woods, enjoying the cold, the chill in the air is, bringing him back to his adventuring roots, and he's excited to be off on his adventure, and he's looking forward to getting his axe back and to breaking some fire giants' necks. And then these, his three cousins show up, and they have some very sad family business to take care of. And it changes his whole perception of his place in the world and what's going on. So that's something I want you to encourage you to think about when you're considering ways of revealing this big overarching type of information that can always feel like it has the pitfall of feeling very expository and not very organic and integrated. And I myself, it was not planned, it was on the spot, but I'm like, I've been holding on to this information, and I think it's time that they got a hint at what's going on in the larger world. And I was very proud of the fact that I was able to organically integrate that into the story in a way that was personal and evocative and kind of pulled everybody in. And everybody was like, oh, are we going to root for Jorgen? Like, do we have to back him up here? Like, everybody was really in that moment. And that was honestly, like, for me personally, as the DM, that was the highlight of the night. We had a lot of fun with excuse me, we had a lot of fun with the dwarf shouldn't have attacked this guy, and the bard shouldn't have cast calm emotions, and they were all kind of giving each other crap about the way that they misplayed or um, their die rolls did not, play out the way that they wanted them to. Like, we had a lot of fun in character and in combat moments during the rest of the session that they really were jazzed about the way that it went. And it was a very compelling, suspenseful fight, and it's not over, and they can't wait to finish this thing off. But for me personally, I was most proud of this NPC scene that played out with them as the witness. Excuse me. Raised the stakes on the NPC that they're traveling with, gave him a whole new dimension, a whole new humanity, but also dropped information. They now have heard about Svardborg. They know that the Frost Giants are organizing a hunt. They know the ordning is broken. They know that giants are turning against giants. Like, you've got some major pieces of this adventure that just got laid out in about a 10-minute scene. So I think maybe to tie this whole thing up is when you are looking at ways to reveal the meta plot, reveal pieces of exposition, whenever possible, find a way to make it personal without it seeming, without it being heavy-handed or being an imposition, intruding on the domain of the players over their characters, without changing a major piece of backstory where it's like, oh, I didn't know if I'd known my grandfather was a tiefling, isn't that something my character would know? We should have talked about that. So there's times where you can step on, the domain of the player over what their character's backstory is and stuff like that, and they will fight you on that. But in this case, I didn't have to step on anybody's toes in terms of who the character was, and they all got a great set of exposition, and they all got emotionally invested in the consequences of what had happened. All right, so it's 3:07. That's our hour. I want to thank you all for joining me. I don't really have time for Q&A today, but I didn't see anybody really drop a ton of questions in the chat. So that's fine. That's cool. We addressed some stuff on Tuesday. I got a little carried away with the recap. I hope it was interesting for you. I'm going to buff up these maps, so I will drop those in the Dropbox folder for our bonus Patreon. For those people who contribute at the $5 or the $10 a month level or whatever it is, I'm going to label these with the number of yak folk and slaves in each particular structure for both during the day and during the night, right? So that's that thing. Dom wants to hear my thoughts about the new book from Wizards of the Coast when you're back. I don't know that I can share my thoughts because I'm under NDA. I have a preview copy of it. I mean, I may or may not have a preview copy of the forthcoming book from Wizards of the Coast, but that's all you're gonna get from me. I'm sorry. I am a known playtester for Wizards, and we're gonna leave it there. So, speaking of the next time that I am back, I am shooting a project, and the dates for that project have gotten moved. They were supposed to be Friday through Wednesday, and they've gotten pushed back for Tuesday through Friday. So there will not be Disorganized play next week. Neither Tuesday will we do a preview or Thursday will we do a recap show. I apologize for that, but that's the way things are going to happen because of my professional life. Oh well. But in the next 2 weeks, we will have Monday Night Dungeon Fight. That will be back later on tonight. Gaurav has time for games, so please join him for that. We've got a whole bunch of other stuff that I did not pull up the latest version of the calendar, so I apologize for being a little bit under the gun here. I wanted to get that map together for you guys, and I've had a ton of things have to come together today. I had an audition, and I had to take the dog to an appointment, and then take the dog downtown. And I'm leaving momentarily to go play improvised Dungeons & Dragons over on Geek and Sundry. So if you are around in the next hour and a half, starting at 4:30 Pacific, you can see me DM for the intrepid Adrian Steinhardt, who is a notable coward and fancy boy. That's always fun. So you can check that out. Or you can check out Gaurav later on tonight, I believe 8:30. He will have time for games. And we got a whole bunch of other stuff going on. Never Tell Me the Odds on Friday. Masks is on Saturday. And Pathfinder will be later at 5 o'clock on Saturday. So I'm curious about this Pathfinder show we've got on Saturday. And that is the first I've heard of it, because I am still recovering from the holiday. So with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate everything you got going on. You can always drop me a line at Dungeon Bastard on Twitter. If you have a question or something that you want addressed more at length or whatever, I will be happy to pick it up the next time that we get together for Disorganized Play. We will be off for a week. I think they're going to run an expedition or something like that. I'm shooting out in Moore Park, so I will not be able to get a game together unless something weird happens with the schedule. At any rate, so thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, let's dungeon! Yes!